Hi, everybody. Michaela here, Executive Director of the Dupree Center. And today I want to talk about burnout, what it is, why it seems increasingly prevalent, and how we might respond. Let's start with what it is. Burnout is a term, it's largely a psychological term, and it started popping up in the literature in the late 60s. And then from there, people started putting some framework and definitions around it and then doing different studies. Most of those initial studies were in the context of the workplace, which is why I think is one of the big reasons why burnout continues to be largely a workplace conversation, though not exclusively. So there's a psychologist called Herbert Frudenberger, and he talked about burnout as a state of fatigue or frustration that resulted from professional relationships that failed to produce expected results or rewards. So he was really zeroing in on the professional relationship. Then, sort of stacked on top of that, was a psychologist named Christina Maslick, and she started to kind of like do some more studies that helped describe, okay, but what is it? What are the different components, and how can we point to somebody and say, yeah, they're experiencing burnout? And she had these three different components: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a diminished sense of personal accomplishment that occurs in among professionals, particularly in relation to those other people they work with and challenging or stressful situations. So again, now we're introducing this sort of stressful work environment in addition to the potentially stressful interpersonal relationships. And then there's been just the last 15 years or so, just a proliferation of studies and resources and commentary and frameworks on burnout, largely because there's been, I think, a proliferation of burnout. So there's a pair of sisters. They're called the Emily and Amelia Nagoski, and they wrote a book, Burnout: With the Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. And they actually went on, that book is largely geared toward women who are, it's professional women, but the principles are geared more widely and are certainly things to look at more generally. They give just a little bit of more terminology to these three components that Maslick gives us. So they say, so this emotional exhaustion. You might be burned out if you're feeling emotionally exhausted, which is the fatigue that comes from caring for too much, for too long, without being cared for in return, right? So when we've given and our care doesn't match what we feel on the other side, whether that's real or perceived, whether it's in those interpersonal relationships or more largely in our business or organization or workplace. And I think this is, I'm not a psychologist, but I think this is where we start to talk about other domains where this can happen as well: church, the family, certain kinds of friendships, right? You might know that you're feeling burned out if you have a sense of depersonalization. What does that mean? It's this depletion of empathy, care, and compassion. You notice in yourself that when you think about the people in your workplace, the people that your work is serving, the system in which you work, you don't care as much. You feel emotionally distant, and in a way that feels like it's the result of the stressors that you've experienced. And then the third aspect that they talk about is a decreased sense of accomplishment. So this is I mean, the worst case scenarios, the sisters talk about this as the unconquerable sense of futility, feeling like nothing we do can make a difference. This is where my theological hat starts to go up and think about, okay, this is sort of the opposite of the hope we talk about in Christ. This is like a sense of despondentness. Like, I don't have hope that this is going to get better. Okay, so that is sort of a picture of burnout. And we could add stories there, and oh my goodness, like the stories that we hear at the Dupree Center of folks who are uh, experiencing burnout. It's very real. But so I'm not going to go into those stories right now, but just sort of maybe picture in your mind if you've ever felt this way, or if somebody that you worked alongside or know personally outside of work of their work context, if this tracks. So I think some of the common conceptions, some of them I think maybe misconceptions about how we get here. I think we people think we get burned out when we just work too hard, when we give too much, we don't have good personal boundaries, we just show up early and leave late and answer emails all the time. And that certainly can be true, and I don't want to diminish that. But again, by and large, when I think about the stories of people that we hear from at Dupree Center, it's a lot less that, and it's a lot more the next two things. So the first one is just kind of like working too hard, not having the best sense of our own personal boundaries, which is very real and can happen. But the second is that our job, whatever's being asked from us, is actually too much and requires more than a human can give, potentially in the time frame that we've been asked to give it. So we've been given too much, and that too muchness starts to communicate on some level that lack of care. We're asked to care for and to give without with feeling like the expectations aren't necessarily carrying expectations on the other side. Um, and then the third thing that sort of comes out of that second one, but I think is distinct enough to name it as a third thing, is burnout. More and more when I'm thinking about a nurse I was talking to the other day. And she's like, I just gotta go. Like, I just gotta go. It's too much. I've been doing this for too long. I've been caring for too many things. Right? That's kind of like the work is too big. It's too much. But also when she talked to me, I just got this sense that the system that she works in was not actually designed for her employee flourishing. It wasn't designed to seek the very best for her. It was designed around patient outcomes, things that are so critical and important, but not necessarily for the mental health and well being of an individual worker or employee in a system. So, more and more, this third thing feels like burnout is an individual response to a systemic issue. So working too hard, that can certainly be the case. The expectations are really just too much. And then the system is not designed to seek the flourishing of its employees. And that's not necessarily because the people who are in leadership in those systems are bad people or not wanting to seek the flourishing, but the way that the pieces move together are not seeking the best for everyone. And again, I hear a lot of stories from people at the Dupree Center that have to do with not feeling cared for by their workplaces. And where that usually comes to a point is not feeling cared for by their leaders, their supervisors, their managers. In my most gracious interpretation of that, it's not because those leaders are bad people and they don't care about the family or the well-being or the emotional uh, safety of the people who are entrusted to their care, but because the larger system actually isn't designed to seek that leader's flourishing either. And in all of that, it feels like there's a whole problem to unravel and to collectively put our shoulders to. Here at the Dupree Center, we do really imagine a world in which leaders are flourishing and they're seeking the very best for the systems and people entrusted to their care. And increasingly, we realize just how complex of an issue that is. We think that Now I think that this has a lot to do with a lot of things, but that the piece of it that Dupree Center can really speak into as a part of a seminary, as a part of a institution who cares deeply about and wants to um, bolster all the goodness of the church, is the role of spiritual formation. What does it mean to be spiritually formed for this kind of world in which burnout seems to be on the rise because our systems are not necessarily designed for our individual flourishing? I have a book called Life in Flux that I co-wrote with Lisa Pratt Slayton, and one of the authors that she kind of exposed me to while we were writing that was a philosopher named Byung-Chul Han, and he wrote a book called Small, one of those like small, really good books that you're like, this is like 80 pages, but I just want to keep reading it. It's called The Burnout Society. And in that, he gets into the levels of what our society, what Western society values and how that shapes all of this. And he talks about the values of positivity and self improvement. So, this is kind of like, how did we get here, right? This is in the how did we get here section. He talks about these values of positivity and self improvement, and that those are the values that are being sort of idealized in Western culture, which means that it becomes a pressure cooker for individuals striving to do more, to sort of make it all happen. When those expectations that are too much come on us, our response is enculturated to give more and to, yes, like, absolutely, like, we'll go in there, like, we'll do that, when the systemic response is not necessarily calibrated to give us more, but simply to ask more. That's certainly, like, you can see how a lot of that over time has gotten us here. I think the other big why in terms of how we've gotten here is that while culture has been building toward this sense of individualism, taking on more individuals role in systemic situations and sort of putting the onus there, I think we've also had any number of patterns and habits that have moved us away from each other as just culture. And Kurt Thompson, who's a really wonderful psychiatrist that works on these kind of issues, he had an article come out in the New York Times with Tish Harrison Warren, who is an Anglican priest. They're both sort of popular writers. They write in the New York Times, and they talked about this was the line that really caught my attention, that we have any number of practices that have us moving further and further away from each other. We are, and I would add, we're less known by our neighbors. We make little room for spontaneity in our schedules. I think we might be less known by our coworkers. We think we might be less known by the people who lead us and to whose care we're entrusted. We've lost the art of building that connective tissue that communicates that kind of care to us. And so, if we're not getting that care in our workplaces, and we're not getting that care in other relational pockets in our lives, then we're alone. And we're that, talk about emotional exhaustion and a sense of depersonalization. And no wonder we have kind of that despondent nature that is the picture of burnout. So that's a that's just that's I think that's kind of where we are, and I think it's important to name that. And again, so okay, what is burnout? That last section kind of jumped into there to, like, why, like, what's behind this? So where do we go from here? Again, I think the Dupree Center, one of the things that we care deeply about is the spiritual formation of leaders across industries and seasons of life so that they can flourish and seek the very best for the people and systems that are entrusted to their care. And there's a lot that is here, and I'm not going to go into all of this in this recorded session, but I want to name one thing, and it comes from Parker Palmer, who is a writer. He's a Christian writer. He writes, I think, one of the most foundational books on vocation, this idea of what is God calling me to in the last 50 to 75 years in the United States. And the book is called Let Your Life Speak. And in this, here's his quote, and I read this. He says, though usually regarded as the result of trying to give too much, burnout, in my experience, results from trying to give what I did not possess, the ultimate in giving too little. Burnout is a state of emptiness, to be sure, but it does not result from giving all I have. It merely reveals the nothingness from which I was trying to give in the first place. And I think one of the markers of what it means to live and work and lead in a distinctively Christian way is to do so from a state of dependence on God that is captured in what Palmer just said here. So when we try to give beyond what God has asked us to do or has put in us, or as Lisa, my co-author, and I would say, is outside of our headlights, I think that is just a recipe to find ourselves in more and more places that are asking more and more of us without giving that kind of care in return. And I think that one of the places to be able to calibrate that which we have to give is the deep understanding of who God has made us to be, who we are, who we aren't, and therefore what is ours to do. And that isn't something we can do alone. And so it returns us back to Kurt Thompson's words in conversation with Tish Harrison Warren that says, okay, how do we recover the act of moving toward each other in the very daily, very simple, very neighborly kinds of ways, right? This is thinking neighborly, and my mind goes to the Good Samaritan. How do we move toward each other in need so that others might move toward us in our need, depending on sort of where we find ourselves in that story? So, burnout is complex, largely leaving it to the psychologist to define that. How did we get here? I think that there's just a lot. And I do think the where we go from here, I think we have there's a Christian response here, and that response is ultimately quite hopeful. We can see sort of what might be with a lot of folks saying, I'm going to kind of anchor myself in the people who know me best, who love me, can help me decide what is mine to do, to stay in my headlights, to not to resist the pressure to give from that which I do not have to possess in the first place, and then let that inform how I'm going to engage with, put my shoulder to, in some cases, remake and redeem the systems that I'm part of. So there's a bit on burnout. Let me know what questions you have. Let us know what comes up for you. There's lots out there. We want to know what you're learning. We want to know what's been helpful to you. Thanks for listening.